some lovely eggs. Okay, Ray, unfortunately we've had to swap and change sessions all around. Ray was cook last week, but luckily he's alive to give us this session. He did threaten that he might have to mime the session because his throat was so sore, but I'm not quite. I'd like to see your imitation, your mime for the different waders. Seeing as they're hard to identify, it'd be very interesting to see how you could mime the difference. Sorry? But it's fantastic to have our experts in various fields to come and talk to us. It's lovely too that we've got so many homegrown or home, I don't know, transplanted people who come and do sessions for us, because this is what makes U3A so special, that we have all sorts of various interests that people can come and tell us about. So thank you, Ray Pearce, for your talk on our little bandies.
Okay, thank you everyone, and yeah, sorry about last week, but yeah, I should get through this. I might make it a little bit shorter than planned. And yeah, the golden rule is not to make me laugh, otherwise I'll just end up with a coughing fit and go down in a screaming heap. And same with too complex questions. So I might just be going yes, no, maybe. And anyway, yeah, it's a bit of an Anzac theme on the bandies, which have this curious east to west migration, whereas waders typically have north to south migrations throughout the world. And I need to acknowledge traditional owners, of course, both sides of the Tasman, and the country that these birds breed in is pretty much all one tribe, the Ngāi people, and so they manage the South Island, for most of the South Island, for 500 or 600 years. So that was sort of the moa country and riverbeds and beaches and so on. So yeah, double-banded plovers is what we call them here. The Kiwis call them Banded Dotterels. So what's the best name, do you think, for these? Yeah, well, Latin name is a good one, because the genus has gone from Charadrius to Anorhynchus, and Anorhynchus, of course, is the wrybill, and so, but the wrybill has been shown to be very closely related to the old Charadrius ones. But yeah, the scientific name is Bicinctus, Charadrius, or now Anorhynchus bicinctus. And there's another one in South America called the two-banded plover that we're competing with. But in fact, the taxonomists probably got it wrong, because how many bands can you see on this female brooding the chick, for instance? And what about the male up on the top left? So these are on the breeding grounds where the bands are much more pronounced. And I can see 4 on the female, perhaps more if you call some of the white interludes as bands as well. So exactly. So they've got a facial band and then a forehead band as well. But when they're here, that you don't really see those bands, and the breast band and neck band are not very well, and not very obvious either. So maybe we'll just call them bandies. Some people call them potterels or dubbers, but we'll stick with that. So what I'll try and cover, if I get through it all, is just the two common shorebird families, the Scolopacidae, which are the sandpipers, and the plovers. So we'll just touch that briefly. And then look at some of the spectacular breeding grounds of the bandies in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but then focus on the migration patterns as we know it, and then ending up with threats and some conservation effort to try and keep these birds going. The Chiradridae or plovers, and bottom right is the bandy. They typically have quite big heads, big eyes, small sort of stubby beak, fairly upright posture, although that one's actually displaying, as opposed to the other two there, which are members of the sandpiper family, the Scolopacidae. And actually Dan has been researching the etymology of some of these names, so chime in if you like, Dan. So a key thing about the sandpiper family is that they tend to have relatively small heads compared with the body, long beaks, and pretty long legs, but quite variable. The sandpipers tend to be more tactile feeders, hence the long beaks that they can probe into the substrate, tidal flats when they're here in Tasmania, and into tundra on the breeding grounds. Whereas the plovers, with their short beak, are more visual feeders. Big eyes helps them there too. There's one exception which we'll touch on later on. There's other plovers around too that you'll recognise. So our two lapwings here are the masked lapwing, which is habituated, and we see them throughout Wynyard and everywhere else. One of a few waders that have habituated. And the other one there is the banded lapwing, which you see more to the west of here, from say about Stanley westwards, and in some of those sandy sandy paddocks. They're a bit more wary, the banded lapwing, but pretty good-looking bird. So they're plovers, big head, short beak, big eyes, upright posture, sort of thing. And here's some more of our local plovers, the red cap bottom left, which you'll see along the esplanade here in Wynyard, and they do attempt to breed there. And the hoodies, which again are mostly concentrated further west along the beaches. I think, Richard, you have them breeding from Sisters Beach, don't you? And then, they're concentrated further west. So they're some of the more typical plovers. And then we get sort of migratory ones that come here from Siberia. So they're the more typical northern hemisphere type plovers that have to escape those polar winters and come as far south as here, and even to the subantarctic islands, some of them. So that the one on the left there is, we have to change what we call it now. I think it's the Siberian sand plover. We used to call it the Mongolian sand plover, but it's still got the species name Mongolus. And then the bottom right one is the Pacific golden plover, which breeds in the absolute northern latitudes of Siberia, pretty much eastern Siberia, some into western Alaska as well, but mostly Siberia. And then they come down here, and we see them in the Robbins Passage and Bollinger Bay area. Perkins Island is a good place to see flocks of a couple of hundred or so. But again, they're fairly typical plovers, aren't they? Erect posture and big head and stubby beak. That Mongolian Siberian sand plover there, they always look as though they've got a black eye. They've been scrapping a bit too much. And what's this one? Is this a plover or a sandpiper? So has it got a large head? No, it's got a small head. Sorry? Yeah, so they've got a long beak, fairly long legs, small head, and this one is again a Wynyard waterfront one. So tattlers are a typical sandpiper. Their genus keeps changing as well. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, right, okay, yeah. So the sandpipers and some of the plovers have sort of classic north to south migrations with a few variations. Yeah, so this is the red knot, which we get coming here to northwest Tasmania, but they've become pretty rare, threatened species. And some of the other ones are okay, but a lot of the waders that come down these East Asian flyways are in a lot of trouble because of what's happening along the flyways, and also at the breeding grounds, less in what's happening in Australasia. But yeah, they have some variations, like the one that comes to Eastern Australia heads across to New Zealand as well, at least part of the population does. But when these ones want to go back, they don't come back the same way. They tend to go out like that to eastern Siberia and then up to the breeding grounds. So nowadays, people with telemetry are finding out some pretty interesting stuff with migrants. Yeah, so there's that red knot example. The New Zealand ones can go straight back up to around Korea. North Korea is ironically one of the best areas for waders to stage, before they go to the breeding grounds, because there's so little development around the estuaries of North Korea in particular, as opposed to China and Japan, where there's so much development, and Southeast Asia, where there's so much human activity and direct predation, people trying to get food in the form of waders. So those are sort of the more classic migrations. But coming back to the bandies and what we see here, and we can see these, I think that bird on the left was certainly photographed in Wynyard. There's a little roost, a little feeding area. So the bird on the left is an adult and non-breeding plumage, so most of them look like that when they're here, with a bit of variation. And the one on the right is a juvenile. See, it's got that scalloped pattern on the feathers of the upper surface. No, so they're 60 grams, so they're about the size of a blackbird, but plumper, obviously. So they're bigger than a red-capped plover and about the same size as a hoodie. So, yeah, thanks, Pam. And then heading over now to the breeding grounds, which are quite interesting. They do occur throughout Aotearoa and New Zealand, where there's not forest, so I think about 30% of the place is forested. Maori didn't change it all that much, but when Europeans arrived, there was a lot of forest clearance. So in theory, there was more space available for bandies to breed. So initially, they probably did quite well after European colonisation. They also occur as far out as Chatham Island, and then as far south as the Aucklands, so that's 52 degrees south latitude. And the Auckland-based birds are actually a separate subspecies, and they're much bigger in body size, so they're about 30% heavier than the mainland birds. And that sort of follows Bergman's rule, doesn't it, about body size and latitudes or colder climates, so you get bigger body mass thing. But they also have longer legs, and that's interesting because that sort of goes against the norm, because in polar environments, birds tend to have short. You can probably see, and especially on the next slide, why they do have long legs, and it's really to keep them dry, because they're walking around amongst megaherds. I think that's an anisotomy, isn't it, in the background with the plover. And then this is some of the breeding habitat on the top of Auckland Island, pleurophyllums, and so wandering around there feeding, probably the longer your legs are, the drier you're going to be. And so that may explain why they do look a lot leggier than the average bandy. That's a spectacular environment there. We did think they were in a bit of trouble, those birds, and I studied them for a few weeks because we were thinking about putting another plover, the shore plover, on Auckland Island, but then decided not to because the feeding was just too similar. But coming back to the mainland, Aotearoa, around the country, this would have been sort of one of the more typical old habitats, old environments for them. You know, beaches, upper beaches. Just go inland and you're going to strike forest. And a lot of the mainland birds still breed in this sort of environment, and it's pretty secure if they breed on the upper beaches. Some of them breed on the top of dormant volcanoes, and so that can be ideal habitat because the vegetation is still quite short, although varied. There can be a lot of variable plants like coprosmas and muehlenbeckias and so on, which attract insects but also provide food in the form of its fruit. This volcano hasn't erupted since, I don't know, 1886, I think, so it's just perfect for bandies to breed. And then a lot of the country, especially in the South Island, is this real tundra-like habitat, you know, just short vegetation, and absolutely ideal. So that would be sort of one of the central Otago type environments. And then sort of up towards the mountains at the foot of a glacier or even on the glacial moraine, you know, that provides good breeding habitat. But riverbeds are probably the mainstay, and particularly the edges that, you know, haven't flooded for perhaps decades, and so the vegetation there is most varied and supporting more insects than anywhere else on that river system. But they do have some associates there. There's a river tern and a river gull and another plover, the ryebill. So that bird has got a bill that turns to the right, which is unique, of course. And if I tell you that it's feeding actually in the water in the riverbed, so you can think about how it uses its beak. How does it use a curved beak to the side to get food from in the water? There's a little tester for you, and perhaps you can come back later on without making me laugh, of course. And there's an endangered stilt on those riverbeds too. And yeah, the youngsters are really quite heavily into fruits, and young bandies, not many others would be into fruits like these ones are. So top left there, that's a muehlenbeckia. I think the same species occurs here, Axillaris. And then this one will be a coprosma. And at this age, they are quite often just abandoned by their parents because they know how to feed. They've been feeding themselves for 4 weeks by this stage, maybe even longer. And so can be independent. But once they can fly, then they'll head off and join post-breeding flocks in what are, or where the feeding areas are best. So how did I get interested in the migration? Well, it sort of came about by accident. When I finished my PhD over there, I had a project on feral cats and ferrets, so they're a mustelid, and we recognised that they were having a huge impact on shorebirds, nesting shorebirds in a lot of these inland areas. And we had this notion that we could perhaps take pressure off the shorebird nesting sites by manipulating the rabbit population. And so rabbits are really abundant in those dry inland areas of the South Island. And it all sort of totally went to custard, of course, but we did find what the scenario was of ideal breeding success of the bandies, and it had nothing to do with getting rabbits down to low levels. That was the worst scenario, which I'll touch on later. But to really measure the benefits to bandies of different manipulations we were doing, we wanted to be able to identify individuals, and so we really had to mark them with colour bands and then see how their nesting success was, see how the juveniles survived and adults survival and so on. And we had a really crude method of catching them on the nest, and so it was just a self-triggering split peg method. So just put a bit of string or fishing line on the stick across the eggs, and when the bird goes back to the nest, it triggers it itself. There are probably more ethical approaches nowadays to catching birds on the breeding grounds, but it really did the trick for us. But as we were doing those studies, there were 1 or 2 sightings that came in. My mate, working on double-banded plovers, bandies there near Christchurch, he had one re-sighted up in the Bay of Plenty. That was about 700 kilometres away, ironically by an Aussie mate of mine. But the bird did actually return to that site year after year after year, so it was intriguing. And then one of mine from the Mackenzie Basin, the high altitude sites, went to Altona in Victoria. And so from that sample of 2, we joked to each other, well, maybe the high country birds go to Australia, the lowland birds stay in New Zealand. And I thought, how do we test this? We should have, just remember that as a sample of 2 that most statisticians scoff at. How many birds did we band? Yeah, that's a good question. Probably about 2,000. And at one stage we had about 1,000 alive, which helped us estimate the total population at the time, sure, we'll come to. And so we didn't use individual codes, we just had a colour code for birds in different regions. So adult males would have a certain code in one region, adult females have different code, juveniles and so on. And I divided Aotearoa-New Zealand up into about 10 regions, and then, lots of sub-regions, which were really just individual catchments or beaches and so on. We thought, oh yeah, that warrants a different colour code. And which was hard enough to do, getting a big sample like that. We had about 20 people volunteering on it. It was a pretty big effort. but then sort of the hard yards sort of started when you wanted to find them on wintering grounds or, you know, staging areas. So this site is Farewell Spit, which is there, the top of the South Island. We thought that might be one of the main staging sites for the migration to Australia. So we spent a lot of time there just walking those tidal flats. I don't know how long it is, 20 or 30 kilometres, where the birds were out foraging at low tide and then go to high tide roosts. And in those sandy environments, you could usually see their legs okay at a high tide roost. But if not, then you just get out and walk the tidal flats. And that way you could see the colour bands on their legs okay. Come across to Tasmania, and other people had way better methods of getting around. And this is Richard. I'm not sure where the photo was taken. Do you know, Richard? Where? Oh, okay, yeah. Oh, look at that. Fantastic. And yeah, so people were starting to see colour bands in Tasmania and Victoria. And this map here was early on in the piece, and it just looking at the Tasmanian pie graph there, this shows the regions A, B, C, D, E, F of South Island, A, B, C, D, E, F, where those birds came from. And you can see that most of them were from C, Mackenzie Basin, D, Canterbury, but also quite a lot from Southland and Central Otago. And I thought, oh, well, this is pretty clear, isn't it? We're going to be able to solve this in no time. But then, and this is a more recent photograph, but then someone, and it wasn't Richard, but someone reported a whole lot of colour bands from Tasmania that didn't make any sense to me at all. And I thought, well, I booked an air ticket straight away. But it wasn't until the following year that I came over and got around the coastal sites of Tassie. It was fantastic. And finally caught up with the person and his birds. And of course they were all South Island birds. He'd got the colours wrong because there were a few problems there. No, that wasn't you. No. And so how it ended up, but if it wasn't for that gentleman, I would probably not be here now, or it would take me a lot longer to get here. But how it ended up was Tasmania and Victoria really showed the same pattern, so dominated by birds from sea and so on. But nearly all South Island birds. There was only one from the central North Island that made it to Victoria. But it's yeah, I'll try to, but I might ask you to. But it's actually a little bit more complex than what this map shows. And for instance, this is what happened with Southland birds. So Southland birds nested on riverbeds or beaches, and December to March versus April to July. How many there? 300 banded. So in December to March, there was a little bit of local movement starting to show up over here as well. But by April to July, about half of them, 47%, were in Tasmania or Victoria. So that was a pretty high proportion. And we just weren't getting any of those birds in the North Island. Central Otago was even more graphic. So that area there, it's it's lovely at this time of year, but in winter, it's just snow, and there's nowhere to feed. There's a couple of lakes, but they've got to go somewhere. And again, 95% of the re-sightings were in Southeast Australia. I think there was one up in Queensland, South Australia. We did get one from WA as well. So that was pretty graphic. Mackenzie Basin, again, dominated by, so 2/3 of the birds heading to Southeast Australia for winter. But we're starting to see a few go north as well. Farewell Spit, some of the northern islands, but still really dominated by Australia. Unlike Central Otago, some of them stayed inland, even though it was freezing cold. There was some lovely lakeshore feeding habitat, particularly at hydro stations where the lakes would be dropping as power was generated during winter, and it was ideal feeding. But by the time you get to these Canterbury birds, it's quite interesting. Only 25% of them were going to Australia, and you started to see this increase in birds coming north and a lot of winter residency in Canterbury, lowland birds. Marlborough, by the time you got to Marlborough up in this area, only 3%. I think that was one recovery at Longford. Yeah, so regarding individuals going to the same wintering grounds, yes, early on in the study we did have a lot of individually coded birds, and I might discuss that later for northern New Zealand, where we did find, certainly a high site fidelity for wintering sites, but not only that, they were often territorial on the wintering feeding areas, which is really, really unusual, and it helped sort of in the interpretation of what was going on here. So, for instance, these westland birds, western side of the Southern Alps, we did pick up a few over here, but mostly they were going north. But there were so few birds banded in some of those areas that we were able to recognise individuals from their plumage from year to year as well. Yeah, so those are individual birds, that 5 there and so on. So the open circles will be 1 year. So where you get numbers, there's multiple individuals being sighted. And so 2% of Hawke's Bay birds were picked up in Australia. That's another one in Port Phillip, I think, probably Altona or Werribee. But the pattern is pretty clear, isn't it, that the southern and the high country birds are the ones that are going to Tassie and Victoria. And there's a summary of it really. So, the southern birds from the riverbeds and ocean beaches there, they were heading a good proportion, probably a lot more than 50% actually would have been going to Australia, because we figured that we were only checking a tiny percentage of birds, particularly in Australia. It actually caused a good deal of consternation about the population size when I started figuring that it was much bigger than what we originally thought. But yeah, Central Otago and Mackenzie Basin birds heading mostly to Southeast Australia. But as you come north within the breeding grounds in New Zealand, those North Island birds, there's only one example that confirmed where a bird crossed the Tasman. So, why that regional pattern? And is the pattern changing? Is the population okay? All that sort of thing. And we don't need to stop now, but if you want to stop now, that's fine. What is it, 10:25? No, we can probably keep going. So any thoughts about why we would we would be seeing this pattern, why the high country birds and the southern South Island birds would come this way and not to northern New Zealand. Yeah, I think that's a really good reason. Any other reasons? Shorter. Yeah, for some of them it would be shorter. Yeah, just. Yeah, that's a good one. So it's an easier migration going north. Yeah, that's right. They'd have to sit and wait for the weather patterns. That's right. That's a really good point. Mm-hmm. Yep. There's no variation. There are a few things, and so they're very faithful to their breeding sites. So the male and female are anyway, and the youngsters will be nesting within 20 kilometres of their natal area. But once they've selected an area to nest, then they'll keep going back to that. And it's pretty much the same with the wintering grounds. So the birds that we saw going to those North Island harbours, the ones that were individually banded, they would go to exactly that site. And so here's some of your suggestions, ancestral. During the peak of the ice ages, most of those potential breeding areas in the South Island would be under ice, or as near to it. And so they've got to go somewhere, and maybe Tasmania is going to be warmer than northern New Zealand. I think I know that that's not true. That's right. Yeah, so I think one thing that we do now know is the pattern changing. These sort of clues about why they would change, because they're always trying new things. And for instance, we know that in northern New Zealand that there's quite a bit of competition with other bandies. So, and that sort of gives rise to that territoriality I mentioned earlier. So they tend to go to exactly the same sites year after year and defend it. And that's really unusual. So that suggests that there is a problem with competition, that once you've got a site, you stick to it. The other thing that comes in there is timing of breeding that you mentioned, Richard. The North Island and coastal northern South Island birds, they are in relatively benign environments breeding, and so they can breed really early, like August, September. They can get one brood away and then maybe even re-nest. And so they can move really quickly to the northern New Zealand harbours and stake up a territory, stake out the best feeding areas and return there year after year. But the birds breeding in the high country and southern South Island areas, they're in pretty tough environments. So, this year they've had snow on them, in October, early November, and so it might have wiped out that early breeding. So they might not finish breeding until January. And by that time, those North Island harbours are pretty well occupied by bandies. And so maybe the choice is, well, do you risk going there, or do you go to some bigger, better, less competitive sites across the Tasman? And that's probably a combination of factors that actually explains what's going on there. But we do suspect that it is actually changing. And so, for instance, in 1974, my first visit to Cairns, I saw a lot of bandies there in August, just before they were due to migrate. But over the decades, they've just gone down to nearly nothing, frequenting the northern Queensland sites. Carol? Well, that's a good question. And it could take them 20 hours to cross. But more recent telemetry suggests that it might be a lot longer than that, because we had assumed a few things, that they would go by the shortest routes, which they don't necessarily do. I'll show a map shortly about that. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Yeah, well, that's right. So how they migrate is normally in small flocks, and they're mixed, adult and young birds in the flock. So I think the young birds, they learn from that first experience. There was an interesting bird that I found on the northern harbours. That was a young bird that hatched really late in the season in a South Island environment where everyone else was going to Australia. But it just leapfrogged right up the country and to the northernmost harbour it could get to in New Zealand. But interestingly, it kept going to that site as an adult. So it didn't, finishing breeding early in subsequent years, it didn't join the little flocks heading to Australia. It just kept going to the site that it knew. And so it looks like the juveniles will follow adults. If they haven't got the energy to do that, they might do their own thing. But once they've decided in their first year where they're going, then I think they'll stick to it. Probably needs a bit more work to really... Yeah, they do. It's amazing just how much extra weight they have to put down before the Trans-Tasman migration. And it's like 25 to 30% extra weight. So they're almost as heavy as those Auckland Island birds, pre-migration. It does seem a curious energy expenditure. But it does make sense when you look at all those things there, that some of which are still to be tested. Are the feeding sites here more productive? And I suspect they are, just from the behaviour of the birds. So, when you see them on the tidal flats here, they're just getting around in loose groups. There's no territoriality unless you get within a metre or so of your neighbour, and they can get a bit of grip. So that's just an individual distance thing. But there's no territoriality that we've seen here, Pamela. Yeah. Mm. Yeah, so you're asking about the cool winter here. Yeah. Yeah, so I think the seasons do affect them. So we've had, cooler weather here, windier weather. It was interesting that the birds here this year, here in Tasmania, did not leave early. If anything, they were later. But is that because they couldn't do that? Or is it because they knew that New Zealand is on the same weather systems and it's just not going to be useful to go back early anyway? As it turned out, over there this year, there were a lot of problems with weather and poor breeding and so on. Mm. Yeah. Yeah, so they wouldn't go back that early. There was one bird that did arrive back from Altona in about the 20th of July, but that was exceptional. Most of them arrived back on the breeding grounds in August. So, so those westerly wind systems that we had would have been ideal for migrating. Some of them may have been a bit too turbulent, actually, but the current hot shots that I'll get onto in a minute will hopefully solve all this with their telemetry. Yeah. We have, yeah. Yeah, it's a good question, Richard, about the survivorship of juveniles and different weights. But no, this work was done in the 80s with different objectives, and so we weren't looking at that. The current telemetry studies going on are looking at that quite closely, and a few other things as well. Yeah, that's right. Mm. 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 Mm-hmm. Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Yeah, it's a good question. Mm. Yeah, I'll get on. They're good questions, Maureen, and I just wondering about a northern trajectory first, and then going across. We had assumed that the birds were going to take a more direct course. After we showed that. Mm, yeah, there are always birds in a flying party that will know where they're going. And so, but there's still a lot to learn there, I think, because we had assumed that those parties that were jumping off from the South Island might go to farewell spit, like you were suggesting, that young ones especially might go to a warmer place and then head west. And we showed pretty early on that that wasn't the case, that they didn't use those staging areas that would have made some sense. And it may reflect just how short a distance it is, and they're built up, their body mass, to do a one-jump migration. But having said that, this is the new guy on the scene, Luke, who is putting radio transmitters on, and also colour banding, colour flagging as well. And they're trying to, and actually this is in my old study area at Lake Tekapo, and so they're trying to figure out just what those migration routes are. So that's where I worked, and we would have birds ending up here and here and so on. But he's finding that if the technology is correct, is that some of these birds just head north, and this isn't a time thing. This is some glitch with detection on the telemetry, but this is correct, that they were ending up in New South Wales. And he had another bird which I don't have that went across more directly to Port Phillip Bay, and then it got sick of Port Phillip Bay and came down to Robins Passage out here. And not only that, at these sites, he's getting information about, you know, where they are, and it's not necessarily along the seashore or estuary or lagoon or anything. This is one near Deniliquin, which actually fed in paddocks, and then the one out at Robbins Passage seemed to spend a lot of time on farms out there, you know, beyond Montague, and so there's still a lot to figure out. So where we're at the moment is that there's a job for us next year, and that is to, you know, look for colour bands. So the birds here at Wynyard, we need to be chasing them up to figure out what they're doing. And then he's got a lot of birds with radio tags as well that he can follow. I was hoping they would do a lot more of these, because I think that's the way of figuring out not only the migration route and timing, but also where the concentrations are, because we're clearly missing a lot of the flock sites. We're just not getting onto them as well. So. Past a month. Oh yeah. No, they won't. So yeah, that's right. So you won't get a year. So it is time to. So everything's limited. I think that's one of the reasons why we're doing a mix of colour banding and colour flagging. So colour banding is what we use. So by repeating that, we can do an exact test, if you like, of how things might have changed since the 1980s. But the telemetry just adds a lot more insight to it. Marking methods have improved, and so this is what we'll see next year more of, these flags, which are a lot more user-friendly for the bird than bands are. Bands aren't too bad. So, yeah, so when we're checking flocks at Wynyard and further west, you know, it's good to have your video camera to home in on these birds. I find that using video is best, because, you know, a photo doesn't give you exactly the right frame. So that's quite cool. So the current study by Luke Eberhardt is his name. He's a German researcher. So he's done quite a bit of work on knots, red knots, and other species that migrate from the Arctic. So we're supporting him with our observations around the tidal flats, New Zealand, Australia, and we'll be able to sort of do that precise comparison, plus the telemetry to give us the individual movements, and probably help answer some of the questions about feeding areas in particular. So, for instance, here we weren't picking them up so much in pasture, but it could be that some of the pasture sites weren't that accessible, and so the Montague's Passage bird has already done that. You know, it's already shown that there are certain pastures that are useful, and so the next step is to figure out why. And you know, there's a grass scrub. I know there's one in New Zealand that we figured, the Costa Lytra grass scrub, that was really important in July and August for a lot of feeding waders. So they would come to the surface, you know, sort of one of the late instar larvae prior to beetle emergence, and they were really important. I suspect that may be what's going on out here in pasture. I know Hazel too has got quite a lot of data on pasture feeding bandies too, which will be interesting to analyse relation to the next stages. Do you feel like having a break, or what do you think? Right. Mm. Yeah. Right. Mm. And you're asking about the pasture feeding ones at Musselroy Bay, and certainly we looked at them in '87 when I came around, and they were feeding on grubs in pasture, and that was June, which surprised me. That was quite early in the piece. Those birds have declined quite significantly. I'm not sure of any current work going on, but we should be doing a lot more here in the northwest, trying to understand the feeding behaviour of our birds, because things could easily change, especially in Bollinger Bay, Robin's Passage. If we have development there, then those lovely tidal flats will really be impacted in the future. It could be that birds are a bit smarter and or get onto some of this later on, as they are adaptable. They've certainly gone to feed in pasture a lot more, in this last century than they would have done originally. So. Yeah. Mm. Mm. Yeah. Right. Okay. Mm. Mm. Yeah, so. Yep. Yeah, that's right. No, that's an interesting observation, Richard, about night feeding. And yeah, the big eyes do help them, but they could be homing in on other cues that we know nothing about. They certainly use hearing as well, so they can hear grubs and earthworms, I presume, moving beneath the ground. And a lot of birds you see actually cock their head, like blackbirds do here, but plovers do as well. So yeah, there's a lot of nocturnal feeding going on around the place. Then night vision's getting better. We should be on to that. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Mm. Yeah. Mm. Mm. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Luke and his team are looking very closely at the weather patterns. So your observation of the bird going north and then west could relate to weather systems that were more favourable further north. But I think they've got a sample of 20 or 30 individuals going at different times now, so they should have a good data set, which I'm not party to at this stage. So. Where do they find their mate? At the breeding grounds. Mm. Yep, that's right. So the Maori name for the bandy is Aotearoa, and that's what the male says when he's defending territory and looking for mates. Yeah, she doesn't say much at all. Yeah, males and females share incubation. So perhaps from now on I'll ask the questions. The first one is, how does the wrybill feed? So it occurs on stony riverbeds, feeds aquatically on those riverbeds. So it's got its head's like this, and its mandibles are curving to the right. How does it feed? Is it like that or that? Is it a tactile feeder or is it a visual feeder? Not really, no, but it can do in muddy substrates. But on the riverbed breeding grounds, rounded stones, water-worn stones, mayfly larvae, and the mayfly larvae, when the water temperature is below 5 degrees, they are under the stone, but not just sheltering, they're actually clinging to the undersurface. So they're just impossible to get unless turn your head over, open your mandibles in a semi-horizontal plane, and the curvature is fitting the undersurface of the stone. And that probably is very critical in those cold spring mornings when the water temperature can get down to sub-zero on those high altitude riverbeds. So there's just no insect activity in the water at all. It's probably a really important adaptation, and you can trace it back through the ice ages probably. But yes, Richard, when the rivals migrate, and they do a south to north migration to northern New Zealand, they stay on the intertidal flats, muddy flats, and they've got that sort of sideways scoop, if you like, a little bit like an avocet, exactly, yeah. That would have been about 900 to 1,000 metres. Okay, so possibly we should be thinking increasingly about how these birds are doing, and not only the bandies, but some of the birds over this side of the Tasman as well. And we started thinking, how many are there, How do you work out how many bandies are actually in existence? Because in the 1980s, the combined Australia and New Zealand wintering counts were producing generally around 13,000 birds, which seems pretty low. And it's still not much more than that, even though our knowledge of where they're wintering has improved. So I thought, well, we know from our colour bands just how many, so you can predict that based on individual lifespans. And so we're asking questions like that. And so when we had 1,000 birds alive and colour banded, on the wintering areas going around checking for them, we would find that we would get a colour banded one, about 1 in 50. And that suggested that there were over 50,000 bandies around the place. But we sort of just shelved that estimate for a while because there was so much opposition to it that there could be that many. But it soon became clear where the missing birds were, and they were mainly in southeast Australia. So in the 1980s we figured out that places like Robin's Passage had a lot more birds than we originally thought. But more particularly Victoria had many more birds than were being counted. And they were seeing a lot of colour-banded individuals in places like Altona and Werribee and so on, that they wouldn't see again that year, or had moved on somewhere, gone inland perhaps. And when you start looking at all the data on distribution, it's clear that a lot of them are inland, and so our coastal counts are really just indexing them. So what's going on at the moment? I'm really impressed with the numbers still in Robin's Passage, even though we struggle to figure out exactly how many are there, just as it's logistically a pretty tricky area. But what is clear is that the ones that hang out in New Zealand are doing worse. They seem to be declining pretty drastically, and there's probably a lot of reasons for that, but we could perhaps work through some of the issues. So this is a typical, it's actually a low country riverbed breeding area, so in pasture country, and you can see that they're just losing habitat. Originally the river would have wandered across to the terrace there. That's a natural terrace, but people they've actually put in rock walls, retaining walls, and then planted with willows and poplars, and then you get this sort of even passive colonisation by weeds like broom and gorse and lupin and stuff like that. So they're certainly losing out with habitat. Yeah. Yeah. It's more particularly a problem for the wrybill and black-fronted tern and so on, which are aquatic feeders, so the bandies are mainly out on these sort of shingle areas, so out in these areas. But yes, if there were wrybills in this river, then they could be impacted by water quality as it impacts invertebrate larvae and so on. It's probably not so bad here because it's coming out of foothills that are probably pretty good. But yeah, you're right, the water quality in some of those lowland riverbeds is poor. One of the lakes that we looked at, I think they worked out if they stopped dairy farming now, it would be 1,000 years before the lake water actually got back to its original state. It's pretty poor. Then you've got all this sort of thing going on, and this here as well. Obstacles and not just wires. Wires are pretty lethal actually from migratory birds generally around the world. Then there's the whole turbine question. So there's a lot of structures. Invasive predators are really a biggie, both sides really, but more particularly at the breeding grounds. And I mentioned that study that I did on ferrets and feral cats, just to try and figure out ways of taking pressure off ground nesting shorebirds like bandies. But we were contracted more by the black stilt conservation lobby. So it was pretty dire. We're down to bugger all birds there, and ferrets were one of the big predators. But the long and short of it was that with that study, we could reduce numbers of feral cats and ferrets by reducing the rabbit numbers in the riverbed. You get the pest board to use 1080 to kill the rabbits, and unfortunately it wasn't killing the non-target, the predators as well. But the ferrets and the feral cats would hang around and scavenge on those carcasses for a month or two, and then they would go. They would leave the riverbed, and you think, we're onto something here. But then what happened? So this is a classic ripple effect. As soon as the ferrets are gone, the stoats arrived. And we know that ferrets and feral cats actually actively hunt and kill stoats because they see them as competitors, presumably. And unfortunately stoats, which are a lot smaller than ferrets and feral cats, they can get by on small prey like birds. And so they absolutely hammered the bird breeding, including killing adult birds of bandies and black-fronted terns and so on. And so we continued that and looked at other scenarios. And the best scenario for birds was to have a relatively high rabbit population that stayed fairly stable over the years. And you'd have territorial cats, territorial ferrets that would exclude the other nasties. And there's a smaller one than the stoat even, the weasel, that will also respond, and also Norway rats and black rats and everything. So what would happen with the ferrets is that, along with feral cats, they would hunt, and very early in their hunting cycle, they would kill a rabbit, and that would do. They wouldn't keep going and killing. They would just go back, drag the carcass. And so that we found that was the way best scenario for bandies and everyone else in that riverbed situation. But it worked best in those high altitude and southern sites, those rabbit areas, and the birds from there are the ones that come our way. And I think that's possibly the number one reason why we've got still a really good bandy population coming here. Yeah, there's stuff the British left behind, you know. So, and well, I remember seeing a ferret near Deniliquin once, and I was out chasing plains wanderers, and that they haven't established. So there's no feral ferrets here. So we're lucky they were tried along with everything else, and New Zealand missed out on foxes even though they were tried. So it's just crazy. But there is quite a bit of predator management going on in these high country sites where the bandies leave to come to Tasmania and Victoria. So, and it's mainly for the other riverbed birds, but the bandies are benefiting. So all these valleys right up to Aotearoa-NZ, Mount Cook, are trapped for stoats, ferrets, feral cats, rats, hedgehogs, possums. Yeah, so I've mentioned predator-free Aotearoa here, which is the big thing at the moment, but there are a lot of other native predators that I'm sure don't like this term. And so, yeah, quite right, the native predators are things like the swamp harrier, which we've got here, New Zealand falcon, which is like a aberrant peregrine, so that sort of size, and then the usual kingfishers and so on. So there are quite a few predators here, but not so many raptors as. So New Zealand had no predatory mammals, so the only native mammals were about 3 species of bat, which they were predators too, of insects. But yeah, so there is quite a bit going on here, and that is benefiting the riverbed bird community pretty well, and also other things too, like the lizard fauna. I think there are up over 100 species of lizards in Aotearoa now, with all the genetic work going on. The communities are doing really well, but you look through there and you can't see a house. and so this is a government-run initiative. It's not directly related to predator-free Aotearoa, which they still haven't figured out which predators to stop at. And I mentioned those ripple effects there, and you can see that it'll be never-ending. It'll go right down to mice, because if you remove the top and intermediate predators, then the rodents will. Oh, yep, yeah. Well, dogs are a big issue there, and yeah, especially in the forested areas. So, you know, pig hunting dogs that have gone wild and so on. They're on top of that now. But yes, that one, I prefer the mainland island, if you like, approach, where you do holistic management, really. So you try and nail your nastiest predators, that's for sure, but then you also have to, you know, get the ripple effects as well. And they can be weeds, they can be herbivores, they can be rodents, and they can be gulls, you know. Where there are people around, the kelp gull is a real problem, you know, so dumps, they're not so bad here in southern Australia, but in New Zealand you just see tens of thousands of them, you know, around towns, around cities, scavengers, but they also, so they've got a young stilt there, so these are pied stilts, and then that silver gull related bird there is also a potential issue. So there's all those sorts of ripple effects. Yeah, kelp gull's been in New Zealand all the way through. So they're, oh right, that's right, yeah. Yeah, that's interesting, that one, because they're circumpolar. They're in South America and South Africa as well. But all of this sort of leads me to highlight the importance of little islands, little motu, not only for, you know, roosting bandies and so on, but also nesting birds. And this is a shot from over here. I think this is probably Kangaroo Island, and a group of bandies there. I don't know, is that Hunter out the back? I'm not sure. And we find in a lot of places that birds like bandies and other waders like a range of potential roost sites, and where they go for nighttime roosting may be totally different to where they go for daytime roosting. So places like Kangaroo Island, you know, pretty much predator free of the nasty predators anyway, is a good safe nighttime roost, you know, and probably the bigger sand spit areas, you know, places like Perkins Island and so on, are really important as well. Here's another impact that we've got both sides of the Tasman. This one is actually here at East Anthony Beach, in the site where the little terns and fairy terns actually nest. And I videoed this boy earlier this year actually, and he was just hooning, you know, through the colony. I didn't see what turned out to be his irate mother. It's just a bit further around, but I ended up having a conversation with her that was very similar to one I had in New Zealand about 40 years ago, except I was a lot more diplomatic this time. And I asked her what she saw as a solution. But, and it's quite a long story, but this is one of the issues both sides of the Tasman. Where those northern breeding bandies are in North Island and northern South Island, they also have a lot of this sort of problem. And, you know, it's one of the cumulative effects that reduces productivity and might not increase adult mortality much, but yeah, there's certainly dogs there as well. So there's all those things going on. Whether or not you choose a site like that to manage is another matter. There may be better sites that the jury's still out on. Oh, yeah. Right. Yeah, so you ask about signage and so on, and it is interesting here. There are signs 6 kilometres away, but there are a few other things too, like land tenure here is different. So, you know, the local landowner owns right down to extreme high water spring tide, and that's out there somewhere. So you're sort of buggered. Like, how do you protect a breeding area like this if you don't have the cooperation of the landowner? There have been similar instances around the world. we found the one that worked the best was to have a model where you had some money and you would get the community to actually do the monitoring and awareness raising. Without that, you just forget it. And I got that impression talking to that lady too, that was the way you could go. But anyway, there's other bigger factors too going on for a lot of our shorebirds. And one of them is climate change and especially sea level rise here, because the birds just don't have good secure sites. So that hoodie, actually that was one out on 3 Hummock Island just recently. It wouldn't have a show because the next tide would be right into there. And all these factors really contribute to low productivity. So yeah, there's a whole list of the summary of issues going on for roosting birds, and then especially nesting birds in that inland and coastal environments. And here's some local examples here of recruitment. So those two green graphs on the left are hooded plover breeding success or juvenile recruitment, sort of back in the 1980s from a Tasmania bird report. Really 20% of winter samples were juveniles, and this is one more recent, Ralph Cooper from Cape Portland area. He was getting 15%, which is pretty good too. He tells me that recently it's really low, and last season I did similar samples out around Perkins Island, and recruitment around 4 or 5% for hooded plovers is just way too low for a sustainable population. And then same with fairy terns, even worse. The fairy terns, probably about 3% of fairy terns out there last year. I think it was 2 out of 70, something like that, were juvenile. Yeah, so if you have a sample of 100 hoodies, then 21 or 22 of them were youngsters. So it's just it's just a simple method, but it's really effective, and it really is showing that, and this needs more data. But when you look around the sites that I was checking anyway, there was just no way they could get through. I couldn't see where the 3 or 4 or 5% had actually come from, because of the tides. The sea level is increasing, and disturbance and so on, and there's other factors too. Yeah, anyway, here's a smart wader. This is probably the only Australian shorebird that's actually increasing in numbers, pied oystercatcher. So what do when they see that that's flooding? Yeah, that area gets flooded each year. I'm not going to nest there anymore. And so they put their nest up here amongst the Atriplex hummock. And then the others too, nesting out in a paddock nearby. Oh, that's pretty smart. But there's sort of a downside too, because this is the next hummock, and I could see there were rabbit and feral cat tracks there. So that can also be an Achilles heel. But the upside of it is that we've got to retain these sort of wide areas. There's potential nesting areas and roosting areas there. These are all bandies, flocks of bandies on Perkins Island, Kingston Point. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Right. Yep. Right. Exactly, and yeah, so catching that number of feral cats, and some of them might be house-based cats too. You never know; it's hard to tell at times. But we've found, particularly with the New Zealand scenarios, that you don't do it for just a week or so. The trapping, you just have to keep going right through the sensitive period, and that for a lot of sites that's all year. And, but anyway, the management, with artificial intelligence and identifying cats and squirting them with the toxic gel and so on, we get in there. So it's just a matter of sorting out which sites we can actually manage. But yeah, this is this other sort of site that needs protection. So none of these sites are protected, but they are actually protected through the goodwill of landowners, really goodwill of the landowners. But that could change. Yeah, sorry. Mm. Right, yeah. They will be a problem, yeah. So those people with the motorbike, they also had a dog running through that area. So if there are running chicks, that's the biggest issue. A dog can't resist that. In my early years of conservation management, we were dealing with dogs in kiwi zones, and I got to autopsy 70 or so dogs that 2 farmers had shot on their property, and 70 over 18 months or something like that. And there was even a sign of kiwi in their guts, but they were eating anything they could get, from possum to berries and everything. So yeah, dogs are an issue for sure. But yeah, and they can smell their prey too. They've got a good sense of smell. But I think a lot of the impact from dogs is seeing a chick run. An adult can fly, but I'm going to end on a more positive note, and very close to here, from down at the waterfront, down at Pine Point, isn't it, Pam? And so Bruce's Cafe is just around the corner there. Just ruined the technology. Can we reset this? Oh, yep. And okay, it was at Pine Point. There's quite a good feeding area out intertidally. But on the incoming tide, the birds actually come in and roost, right beside that footpath. They're about 8 metres or 8 to 10 metres from the footpath. People walking by, cycling, dogs coming by, and here are these birds just down off the side. They've actually habituated because they regard that as a safe roost. And that's really encouraging. We can look at other applications where that might actually work too. You can't really beat those isolated sand flats and islands, out in Robbins Passage and the likes. But we're in human areas. We've got sites like this where the birds can actually live side by side with us. Yeah, Pine Point, just before Bruce's. Sorry? Yeah, it was ironic. I should have. I took a photograph of the sign there, but it is. Yes, thank you. That's good, Reese. Yeah. So if I'll try not to do that. So Bruce's Cafe is just up the road there, and Pine Point is back here, and so you've got a footpath, and the the old Bass Highway. And where are the birds? Yeah, good point. Yeah, so if you look at that spot there, you might not be able to see that bird or that bird or that bird or that bird, but I'll zoom in on with the next shot, and so yeah, it gets a bit blurry. Yeah, so there's a bird standing there, one there, one there. Oh, is that one there? Oh yeah, there's one there. Yeah. So that's quite intriguing, and it's not that great a sight, but it's free enough of dogs and free enough of house-based cats that they regard it as safe. But that's right, yeah. But if they do get disturbed, then they'll be somewhere else. We're not sure where that is. No, they don't do that. Yeah. Oh, yeah. They're in New Zealand at the moment. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Mm. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Mm. Yeah, yes, as you say, Pam, they've lost their roost site now, but they're back in New Zealand. So hopefully, some other site, perhaps even this site, will be suitable next year. We'll find out. So they should start arriving. When do they arrive, Richard? February, March. Yeah, and. No, that's fine. Yeah, so disturbance, you say, Richard, with traffic, regular traffic or more frequent traffic than that, the birds would adapt to anyway. There's still a bit of work to do there with awareness raising, within the family, obviously, the next generation and generations. But so I mean, there have been incidents there that we've noticed, and it is just a matter of getting the message across, within the family, I think. And it could be that places like that are just as effective or more effective even than government sites. They tend to invite, people in for various things. So that to me is good. There's a lot of interest at the moment about artificial roosts, potentially even breeding sites, and so we shouldn't forget, the likes of this scenario, and getting people on board. It can be an Achilles heel if you put up too much signage, but if this is working at the moment, then that's fine. Leave it at that. There's quite a bit going to be learnt over the next year or so, with the migration side of bandies and hopefully more conservation effort too. So we can report back on that at some stage. But I just want to get some answers back from you about the ryebill feeding, and or shall I just tell you how they feed? Or have I told you? Oh, I didn't get to the next step. Sorry. So they feed that way. There's 2 other birds around the world that have got curved beaks that occur on riverbeds, and one of them is called the ibisbill in the Himalayas, and I went to study that one because after having studied ryebills, I couldn't for the life of me figure out how a bird with a down curved beak could use its beak to get at those same mayfly larvae. And so I traipsed up into the Langtang Valley where I was hoping there would be some, and there were, and found that virtually everything was the same. The water temperature below 5 degrees, no activity of anything at all, so they had to be tactile feeders. But the difference was that there were no mayfly larvae clinging to the undersurface of the stones. There were larvae of a whole lot of insects that were just sheltering under the stone. So the ibisbill could use its beak just to go round, getting some benefit from having a down curved beak, but still opening sub-horizontally. So it was quite intriguing. Yeah, that was just a little aside I thought I'd tell you about. So yeah, that's the bandy story as we know it at this stage, but I think in the next 12 months it'll be pretty interesting, I think, with how the birds fly in different weather systems and different islands. You know, they've been showing up in places like Norfolk Island, Lord Howe Island, Fiji, so it's intriguing. Yeah. Okay, thanks for being a attentive audience.